Hey there. I know my hair looks really, really crazy at the moment. I'm just gonna oil it while we talk because I've been thinking about talking about this subject. And, as I move on in life, sometimes I'll go just review everything that I've learned from certain situations, right? And sometimes it's my cards that will give me the prompting to do so, you know? And a lot of times that's what will lead me to revisit the topic because otherwise I'm not really trying to be living in the past. There's certainly lots of things that started in the past that are not yet resolved in my life, but unless it's in front of me, I'm not really focused on it. So, thinking about times that I sort of sacrificed myself in situations in order to be in relationship with others. Um, and how I learned, only in retrospect, how I learned what could have actually prevented that situation for myself. And what it is basically I'll show you how it's been pieced together for me. When I became aware of narcissism, it was quite a rude awakening for me, and I was pretty old. I had already lived in it, not just on the receiving end of it, but a perpetrator of it in my relationship dynamics as well, because it was just passed down through my family line. And we were trained to step in line, to stay in line and do what is expected of you because it's expected of you. There was no regard for how that affected you or what that meant to you, or if you know it was just that type of upbringing. And when I became too much burden, and that was simply because my emotional needs were never even acknowledged, never met, never looked at as something that meant anything, right? And that was a lot of the other people in my family were able to stay in line and suppress or deny their emotional needs, or decide they didn't have any. So I was kind of the odd man out that way, but I was put into foster care because I couldn't conform to the expectations that I should not have emotional needs. That just wasn't it just, I'm a moon in Cancer. I'm a Scorpio. These are water signs. Water signs usually have a lot of emotion. Water is emotion, right? All right. So anyway, waking up to the realization of that as a way I had been brought up and living, and suffering the effects of. It was through the suffering the effects of later in my relationships, the relationships that I chose to be in, where I seeked out information on what it all means and how to recover from it. Because upon waking from it, just knowing about it didn't solve it for me. I was very, very codependent. So I was operating from a place of real neediness. And again, that stems because the need that I had for my emotional needs had never been met. Not by me and not by anyone else. And it was always dismissed as something that wasn't important. Even though I couldn't escape it, right? I was drowning in it. I was literally drowning in it. But that, you know, I was put into like counseling and medicated, and none of that solved it. So there's no way for it to be solved for me. So it's just like, she's a nonconformist. She can't fit into this family and what was expected. So like, I guess we got to give up on her. And there was not really a fully giving up on. It wasn't like that. Like, my mother was doing her best. She didn't know what to do. She was just brought up that way too. And when you start looking into the things required to heal from that, one of them is like getting to know yourself and loving yourself, right? And it was like, oh, I've never even thought about myself. I was like almost 40 years old and I had never thought about myself. Like what I liked. I was almost 40 years old and I had never thought about what I liked, what I wanted out of life, anything. The only things I had done up to that point, because I was in trauma's responses to the ways that I was living in the household that I grew up in the households. It was people pleasing. It was being useful. It was don't step out of line. It was do what's expected of you. And that carried over into the foster homes that I was put in. And then, I graduated high school at age 17, so I was on my own then. Actually, I was still a ward of the state, so I was put into college, by my social worker. But I was in a traumatized state, and I didn't do well in college. Could not prioritize, you know, schooling. I was in survival state and trauma. So anyway, but that was one of the requirements. It was like, you know, think about your strengths, your weaknesses, and what's important to you. So that was one of the very first activities that I did in order to start healing from these type things, right? And that was hard because it felt weird to realize that I had never thought about my own wants or desires up to that point in my life. That I'd only ever lived for pleasing other people, being useful to other people, getting the approval of love of other people, even if it was a breadcrumb. And it's like, okay. But further along in my journey, I came across spirituality. And I was introduced to it mostly through astrology. I started using astrology because I was codependent, because I was a people pleaser. Even knowing about my strengths and weaknesses and what's important to me, that didn't solve it for me. I was still codependent. I was still coping in the ways of thinking I needed a relationship, thinking I needed people outside of me to approve of me in order to be useful or likable or lovable or anything, to exist. I didn't feel like I even existed outside of someone else's want from me. And so when I started learning about astrology, I learned that my sun sign, which is, like I said, Scorpio, was in the 9th house. So in the astrology chart, the birth chart, the chart is broken down into houses so you can see what part of your life the energies play out in predominantly. And the 9th house signifies higher minded stuff, philosophy, spirituality, religion. I didn't grow up with a religion being taught to me. I was told that I was Protestant, but we never practiced that or anything. I don't even know what that entails or means, even to this day, because I haven't studied religions. So I got into spirituality that way, and at first I remember reading about it and being like, well, that's not true, that's not me, but it sparked something in me, and before I knew it, I was being guided and shown information, and my curiosity was leading me into all these cool things to learn, and I loved learning. And that's what the ninth house is about too, learning, higher learning, and philosophy, and all these things that were actually presented in ways that seemed like solutions to the issues I was suffering. So I stepped into spirituality quite naturally through this healing process, and then found its value because it was stepping into a higher view that helped me sort of like try again and make sense again out of what I was even doing here. It was like, okay, well, I had lived so much suffering in my life up to that point that I needed it into a context, Like I needed to say, like, there needed to be a reason on why that was. Like it couldn't just be just because, because if I was going to believe in God and life and continue on, it had to be for a reason. And so spirituality gave me potential reasons, and things that felt true to me and right to me, and context and framework within with which to get to know myself through like the astrology and through some other ways we have of looking at energy, and defining energy for a human through charts and dates and whatnot, right? So as I studied the chart more and more, I couldn't really deny that there was validity to it, right? Because I was like having like the experience of seeing the life that I had lived in the chart that I was shown. And it was like, okay, well, if it's written in the stars that I would experience this, then it's not just random. There's something to this. There is a higher meaning. There is a reason bigger than me. And that made it possible to go on. And also, like, I got introduced into spirituality as a topic. So I started, like, looking into certain spiritual teachers that came across my path, and teachings, and just people who were talking about spirituality in groups on Facebook and wherever I encountered it. And through all of that, I caught the resonance of a lot of things, like Reiki, I tuned myself to Reiki and was able to experiment with that. Did quantum healing through the teachings that I encountered. Experimented enough, like didn't just like trust everything right away. Experimented my way through into enough belief that when I felt resonance with Christ consciousness, I fully adopted it and understood that, my heart was the most pure thing, and that everything else was basically a lie. That anything besides that pure Christ consciousness that I was experiencing or living out through my own actions or the actions of others was just a lie. So it was very easy, because it felt right and because I had been led there and I knew it. It was very easy to adopt or to devote myself to Creator, to God, to Source, right? To like a life that offered me some higher meaning and offered me comfort and faith, the ability to just be trusting in love and myself, and that the universe is divine and that it is orchestrated in such a way where, it makes sense to someone somewhere. Yeah. And as it was meant to, it was being revealed to me. That's what I felt, So, continuing on in my spiritual journey, I was led a lot of places and absorbed a lot of knowledge, experimented with a lot of different things. And so different concepts I came to, like the twin flame journey, took me pretty far. And I was adopting what I understood about the twin flame journey because like the shoe fit for me in the teachings. And it resonated as true. And it felt like that's what I was meant to do. And in retrospect, I do think that's true. But I think that it was true because I was meant to engage with the process and uncover the misunderstandings within that process that I had adopted because they were fed to me through other teachings. And it may have been that those teachings were done by people who that was their truth. But what I had to come to find out was like that was not my truth. And just adopting somebody else's truth wasn't going to work on a long-term basis, right? Like there was a need for me to not just blindly adopt a teaching in whole based on the fact that it's defined a certain way by someone. I had to learn that I needed to define things for myself. So I set out to do that, and I broke a lot of the rules, just simply by going by what felt right to me. And if I look back at relationships that I stayed in and with certain other people where eventually what it came to was that it was just so draining on my being. It was draining on my being that my health was deteriorating just being in consistent contact with these certain people. You can call them energy vampires or narcissists or, whatever. But I wouldn't have been in those relationships if not for my belief that I was meant to devote myself to them. One of them was a twin flame. Actually, there have been a couple of those that I have devoted and invested in that ended up draining me. And there was also one with a family member. And with the family member, it was my devotion as a family member that kept me feeling like it's the right thing to do to stay in this, right? So I was being challenged on my belief of what am I devoted to? And what it brings me back to is if I know my strengths, my weaknesses, and what's important to me, then I know what's appropriate to devote myself to. And I'm not just saying, oh, God, source, my role as a family member has me needing to devote to this above all else, even to the detriment of myself. Because that's not how it works. If I know that one of my weaknesses is wanting to people please, is wanting to caretake people, if I know that I was trained growing up to always look at how I can serve others, if I know that that's one of my weaknesses, I'm prone to that, and it is not my strength to look out for myself, to self-care, and to prioritize my own needs, if that's the case, then knowing those things and knowing what's important to me, like isn't it important to me to self-care in order to proceed in life? Like if I don't care for myself, I can invest in something that will drain me to the point of taking my life or giving up my life. And it's like, well, what good is that? So those three things, the strengths, knowing my weaknesses, and knowing what's important to me, are vital in helping to determine and helping to understand if I'm living true to myself in what I'm devoted to. Because God, source, universe, my plan to come here was not to sacrifice myself to the degree that I would give my life or my health or anything like that. So if I'm in a situation that I was led to, that I needed to have the experience of, that I knew without a doubt that source, God, guides, my highest self was leading me into the situation that I was meant to have the experience, it was a mistake for me to believe that that equated to it's supposed to work out in this way that you expect. It's supposed to work out in this way that you prefer. No, I was meant to go in as a student. And I thought I was going in as someone who was led and someone who was guided into a situation she was meant to be in. And I didn't combine that with knowing my strengths, weaknesses, and what's important to me. Because if I had, then I would not have stayed so long. I would have understood that what I'm being taught here is what the process is of deciphering when you need to take time for yourself, when you need to step back, when you're too self-sacrificing, when it's not okay, when you're not being reciprocated, when it's unhealthy, you know? There are people who live lives of sacrifice, and I know that I've probably lived other lifetimes of sacrifice, and that's specifically why I needed to learn this. My soul needed to be really clear on what am I devoted to. I thought I'm devoted to God, and I'm devoted to being a good mother. I'm devoted to God, and I'm devoted to being a good family member. So I thought, I will sacrifice for God. I will sacrifice for my family member. But no, that's not what the lesson was. That's not what I was meant to do. I wasn't meant to just throw my whole life away in this lifetime. And maybe other lifetimes I did that, and maybe that's why I know that that's not for the highest good of all. It's not for the highest good of all. So even though I was led into situations, and one in particular that I felt like it would have a high outcome, that when I asked, I was shown, yes, it will have a high outcome. Well, I think that people have free will, and we can intend on that, and we want to intend on that the outcome is in the highest good of all. But that doesn't mean, remember, we want to be detached from what the outcome is, because we want to be able to handle ourselves no matter what it turns out to be. So if you're led into a situation and you expect it to turn out one way, you might be blindsided when you realize that, oh, actually, I needed to be able to caretake myself because that person didn't show up in the way that they could have. Their potential was not met. They didn't do the thing, you know? Like maybe we arranged it and talked about it. Like a bunch of opportunities and potentials are what we're dealing with here in life. So just like I've made decisions in life that led me down one path, on the other path, it would have been a completely different life. It would have been a different thing. Other people are doing that too. Everyone has free will. They make the decisions they make. And so you have to be kind of like, I don't know, light on your feet. You have to kind of know yourself and be, have the sanctuary be within yourself, and that like, okay, I'm a person that if I'm going along into an experience and I'd like it to turn out this way, but I don't know how it'll turn out. So I need to be able to caretake myself through the experience, be willing to have the experience, but also be willing to caretake myself if the experience doesn't go the way I would have preferred. Both things are true. I need to not throw my life away in despair if it doesn't turn out the way that I wanted it to, you know? Just because I was led there, it doesn't mean that every piece of the puzzle is going to fall in line. If I was encouraged to think the best, that's because that would have been the most helpful vibration for me to bring into the situation. So So I feel like I want to use two different words to distinguish like expectation and expecting the best, because it has to be lighter than expectation. It has to be, if I'm brought into the situation and I'm told like, sure, this is a favorable thing that's going to come out of this, I have to know that the favorable thing might not be what I expect that it is. It might not be what I prefer that it be, because I don't have the biggest picture view. So what I have to do is be prepared and hold space for that highest good and show up in the best way that I can in that situation, and then don't lose myself or take it personally or use it to hurt myself or tell a story about how I wasn't good enough when it doesn't go to the way that I wanted it to. I'm allowed to want it to have, to have a certain outcome. But in the cases where I wanted a certain outcome in these relationships and it didn't happen, I see that the ones that came about later on in my spiritual journey, where I already knew myself pretty well and I already knew how to recover myself from an out of balance situation, I can see how much more how those did not cause trauma in me. But how earlier on, when I was having expectations, when I needed it to be, when I stayed too long because I thought I needed to sacrifice everything for the outcome that I wanted, that was me causing additional trauma to myself and putting my focus on something that was ultimately detrimental to me. So actually hurting myself to do so. So I don't think, like, when I say staying light on your feet means that you never commit to something. I don't mean that. I mean, like, when you commit to something, when you decide what you're devoted to, you know that it's something that's reciprocal, that's healthy, that you're not sacrificing, that you're not the only one putting everything in, that there is a feedback, that it's not just faith and whim and hope that brings you into a situation. Like, if you're dating somebody and you've devoted 5 years of your life dating them, it's funny that as I said that, I was like this, thinking of a thread that I just saw on Facebook, an Am I the Asshole thread, where this girl was saying that she had dated this guy for 5 years. But as I said it out loud, I was realizing, oh my God, that was my situation too. So here I am speaking about it as if it's someone else's situation, but mine too. If I'm dating somebody for 5 years and I'm expecting that it's leading somewhere, like to marriage, right? But I've never had an indication, a verbal indication or reassurance, or even the behavior of that person doesn't match that. It wasn't right of me to just hold faith and just be like, yeah, he'll come around, or yeah, he just needs to see, or I feel this way, so it must be reciprocated, or he keeps reassuring me, so I'm sure that he means that. He's just emotionally retarded. He'll come out of it. I just need to hold the space. It's like, well, what am I devoted to? Am I devoted to God? Because God doesn't want me to sacrifice myself. Am I devoted to myself? Because then I'm not going to sacrifice myself. Or am I devoted to Him? Because then I have the tendency to sacrifice everything. And what good would that be? Because He literally would and did leave me on the side of the road with nothing, leave me for dead. And it's like, okay, this person God led me to, I devote everything to, and meanwhile leaves me for dead. And it's like, okay, this is a harsh lesson, but there's something here to look at, because I had to go through all kinds of feelings about that, right? On that first one, that old one that I'm talking about, where it was like that, and it was like anger at God, anger at my spiritual path, anger that I couldn't trust myself because I knew I was being led, so why couldn't I trust myself? And, all kinds of things, questioning my faith to the utmost degree. But really, it's like God isn't just like, here, telling us all every move we make. Like, we do have free will, and it's not just a test. It's like, what do you want to do now that this is the case? It's like, oh, okay, yes, we led you to this person. There's a potential here, but they don't want to show up for that potential. So what do you want to do now? Well, it would have been easy to decide what I wanted to do now had I known what was important to me and what my strengths and weaknesses were, and had that all in mind in the decision making process. But instead, the only thing I was willing to do in that earlier on situation was know that I was led there and expect that it should have gone better because I was led there. It's like such a immature view, but I really did have it, you know? Because like I said, I was almost 40 and I had never even considered who I am. So this is kind of like a crash course. And this was kind of like a major situation, right? Like, that's the relationship I entered in during that time when I first started my healing journey. And by the end of it, which was like 5.5 years, I was like, oh, this is a crash course in get to know myself. This was a crash course in, like, look at all the ways you're willing to sacrifice. Look at all the ways you don't think you're good enough. Look at all the ways you're willing to settle for less. Look at all the ways that you have left to grow and learn and kind of like graduate out of. And I didn't know that all at the time, but in retrospect, that's what it looks like to me. That I was literally led there because that was even if he didn't want the potential, it was still a like ripe grounds for me to learn from. I don't know if I don't know if anyone knew how devoted I really would be to that potential. But I was devoted to potential in my life on so many occasions. Even before I met that man, like every relationship I was ever in, I thought that's the one. Everyone. I never willingly had a one-night stand. I never entertained any man sexually without thinking this is the man I'm meant to be with for life. And that is the truth. That is a fact. And that does reveal how really immature, like, I was right into adulthood. I I was just traumatized before then. I didn't know, and I didn't have an example of it, and I was literally just in survival mode. So when did I have time to learn that? You know, all I had was examples of fairy tale movies and soap operas growing up. You know, I had a set of grandparents that were married for, their whole lives, basically. So I thought the fairy tale was real. I thought that it was real. I wanted it to be real. I thought, since I want the fairy tale, that must be God with what God is leading me to. So now I've had to look at, what am I devoted to? What am I devoted to?